Good evening and welcome to the Art Theater. Please. My name, I remind you, is Craig Smith. I am the director of the Center for First Amendment Studies at California State University, Long Beach. And you can go to our website just by going through the campus website, and you can look at all kinds of interesting papers on the First Amendment. We tell you things like what is hate speech and what's not hate speech. You can find out whether your friend libeled you or not by looking at our white paper on what is libel and what is defamation. We have recently put up some decisions that the Supreme Court has seen the wisdom to put through, and we've evaluated those. While I was in Rome this summer teaching a course there on freedom of expression, I met with Justice Alito, and he was nice enough to go to dinner with me. We have a picture together. That's on the website if you like justices of the Supreme Court. My research director, Professor Kevin Johnson, recently met in Washington, D.C. with Justice Kennedy. And so we have him up on our website too. So we're getting around and we're having fun, and I think that's a good thing. A couple of notes real quick, and then I'll get into the lecture and then let you see this wonderful first adult Western. The start time is always 7 o'clock. I don't know who started the 6:30 start time thing, but in all of our literature, it's 7 o'clock. That's when it's supposed to start, and that's when we do start. So parking opens up around 6:30, so maybe that's what they were thinking, but I hate to have you standing out in the cold and the rain and the wet when you can just walk in at 7 o'clock. 2 weeks from tonight, the next film is one of my favorites. It's The Little Foxes, and it is based on the play, the Broadway play by Lillian Hellman. And Lillian Hellman, as some of you may know, was a Stalinist, and so she was blacklisted and had a lot of fun in her life. She wrote Pentimento, which was made into the movie Julia, which starred a number of important people like Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave. In any case, next week we'll be looking at, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll be looking at Lillian Hellman and the movie starring Bette Davis, The Little Foxes, and I think you'll find it fascinating, not only for the movie, but for Lillian Hellman's private life with Dashiell Hammett, who was her lover, who wrote The Maltese Falcon, which we don't have time to show. Okay. Tonight's film was written by Carl Foreman. It's High Noon, and it's an adult Western that runs in real time. It's a 90-minute film, and the action takes place over 90 minutes. So it's very innovative in that regard, but it has some heavy under-themes that we're going to look at in a minute. Now let me recontextualize everything for you by going back to 1459 and the invention of the printing press. Now, why would I go back to the invention of the printing press? Because one of the themes of this course is that when new technology comes along, the government moves in and tries to control it. So Gutenberg invents the printing press in Mainz, Germany, and what's the first thing he has to do before he prints anything? He has to go to the Cardinal of Mainz, and the Cardinal then gives him permission after he's read what Gutenberg is going to publish. And Gutenberg publishes Bibles. If you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., they have a Bible, and they turn one page, a Gutenberg Bible, and they turn one page every day. And the reason is so it gets even light wear and so on and so forth. And because you can all read Latin, you'll really enjoy it. No, not anymore? It's very large Latin print and very beautiful. Charles VII of France was the Dauphin that Joan of Arc put into power. When he heard about the printing press, he sent a spy over to Mainz named Nicholas Jensen. And the spy came back and said to Charles VII, "You have nothing to worry about. The Archbishop has it under total control." So new technologies threaten people. The new technology we're looking at is the motion picture industry. When did it start? How did it happen? One of my favorite stories is the invention of the term motion pictures. Here's how it happened. William McKinley, the President of the United States, one of the very best, he was a nice man. He was, kind of crony capitalist, but, he was all right. He traveled to the exposition World Exposition in Buffalo, New York in September of 1901 and was assassinated by John Schollgoltz, an anarchist. They tried to locate the bullet that they couldn't find. They opened him up, they unfurled all of his intestines, they wrapped them in towels, they put them all back into him, and eventually they called Thomas Alva Edison up and said, help us try to locate the bullet. He couldn't find it. McKinley died. 6 weeks later, they were very efficient in those days. 6 weeks later, they electrocuted Schollgoltz. And they had Edison film it with his new camera. And they said, what are you going to call this? And he said, I think I'll call it motion pictures. And that's how it started. The first censorship of this new technology, once it became commercial, was not far behind. It occurred when the United States entered World War I in April of 1917. Motion pictures were not allowed to undercut the war effort. So the Woodrow Wilson administration, and we talk about civil libertarians, right? Set up a commission, a government commission, that would censor all films. That stayed in effect until the 1950s, when the motion picture industry said, we'll do it ourselves if you let us alone. And then we got the Motion Picture Association of America and the rating system. So right away, pictures were in trouble. At the end of World War I, recall, there was a Red Scare in America. Anarchists allied with communists, and people got the two confused. But when Russia pulled out of the war with the defeat of the Tsar and then the defeat of the Mensheviks and the success of the Bolsheviks, the communists became a menace. Woodrow Wilson, our hero in the story, then sent an invasion troop of Americans into Archangel, Russia, to support the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. In the United States, at the same time, we had an attorney general named A. Mitchell Palmer. And his house in Georgetown was blown up by anarchists. Now imagine if the attorney general's house, Eric Holder's house, was blown up, or John Ashcroft's house was blown up, what it would be like. Guess who lived across the street from the attorney general? There was nobody in the house when it was blown up, so nobody was hurt. But living across the street was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt. And he came over to check out what had happened. Well, you can imagine. 5,000 people were arrested across the country. Anarchists were thrown in jail. Red Emma Goldman was exiled. And we had our first Red Scare. Then, a decade and a half later, we were thrown into the Depression. It was a very bad time. 1/3 of the workforce was unemployed at various points during the Depression. People began to embrace socialism and communism as a way out of the problem. Many people joined communist clubs. They weren't called cells, they were called clubs. They were called cells in other places, but in America they were called clubs. They were clubby, nice people that liked to get together that way. At the same time, you had people like John Steinbeck writing novels like The Grapes of Wrath, which excited people about communism and socialism and pointed out how bad things were in America. You had the labor movement strengthening itself. There was literally a battle over one of the bridges that crossed over the highways in Detroit between the UAW and the workers for Henry Ford at the Ford plant. Things were kind of crazy. And then we went into World War II. At the beginning of World War II, before we entered in 1939, you remember World War II started with a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin, which didn't do the communists in this country any good. But very soon, crazy old Hitler invaded Russia, and Stalin then obviously broke off the non-aggression pact and went to England and the United States and said, I'm your friend now. And of course, Winston Churchill said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we became allies, and it was okay to be a communist again. And then the war ended. And then we have the countdown. 1946, as I pointed out last time, Winston Churchill comes to Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and gives a speech in which he says an iron curtain has descended from the Baltic to the Adriatic because the Soviet Union won't get out of these countries that it occupied during World War II. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. In 1947, the House On-American Activities Committee got underway and began to call people in, and there was a loyalty oath that was required by the President of the United States, Harry Truman. 1948, Alger Hiss is discovered to have been a member of a communist club in the 1930s and eventually is convicted of perjury. And since he was the Undersecretary of State, this was mind-boggling to the American public. 1949, China falls to the communists and the Russians drop an atomic bomb. How is all of this happening? How do we make sense of this? In 1950, we go to war in Korea after North Korea invades South Korea. And that allows somebody to come forward and try to simplify everything for everybody. And his name was Joe McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, who preyed on the paranoia that was going through the country. And he had a simple explanation. He had a list, and he waived it, of 205 subversives in the State Department as he told that club of Republican women in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950. That's the context for the film, the making of the film, High Noon. High Noon was released at the height of the McCarthy period and the Blacklist era in 1952. McCarthy had established himself with that speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and his claim made sense to Americans in light of all of those factors that were just mind-boggling. We had won World War II, how come everything was going wrong? 1952 also marked the start of an election year in which the Republican nominee, General Dwight David Eisenhower, would appear on the stump with McCarthy. Eisenhower's running mate was Richard Nixon, the man who brought Alger Hiss to trial. One of the great ironies of High Noon is that its very well-known star had already won an Academy Award for his portrayal of Sergeant York, Gary Cooper, and he appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee as a cooperative witness and named names. In 1951, even with the US Congress under Democratic control, the House Un-American Activities Committee launched a second wave of investigations following up on their 1947-1948 session. Actor Larry Parks was called before the panel, and they asked him to name names. And Larry Parks said the following: "Don't present me with the choice of either being in contempt of this committee and going to jail, or forcing me to really crawl through the mud to be an informer. For what purpose? I don't think it is a choice at all. I don't think this is really sportsmanlike. I don't think this is American. I don't think this is American justice." Parks ultimately testified, becoming, however reluctantly, a friendly witness, and found himself blacklisted nonetheless. It ruined his career and it ruined his life. In fact, the legal tactics of those refusing to testify had changed by this time. Remember, last time we saw that the Hollywood 10 relied on a First Amendment defense and lost. So now, the new group invoked the Fifth Amendment, the shield against self-incrimination, though as before, the Communist Party membership was not illegal. While this usually allowed the witness to avoid naming names so that they couldn't be indicted as part of a conspiracy, Congress said taking the Fifth was tantamount to treason and very often put people on lists that Hollywood then translated into their blacklists. Thus, we should be clear. Blacklisting was a film industry form of censorship, not a government-imposed censorship. Historians at times distinguish between the relatively official blacklist, the names of those who A, were called by HUAC and in whatever manner refused to cooperate, and or B, were identified as communists in the hearings, and the so-called gray list, those others who were denied work because of their political and personal affiliations, real or imagined. The consequences, however, were largely the same. The gray list also refers more specifically to those who were denied work by the major studios but could still find jobs on Poverty Row. Let me just take one story. Composer Elmer Bernstein was called before HUAC when it was discovered that he had written some musical reviews for a communist newspaper. After he refused to name names, pointing out that he had never attended a Communist Party meeting, his career tanked, and he found himself composing music for movies such as Catwoman of the Moon. So that was a delightful movie. You didn't see that one. Only years later did he become the Academy Award nominated and winning movie score celebrity, once the blacklist was broken, and we saw when that happened in the 1960 last time. Our subject for tonight is Carl Foreman, the son of a working-class Jew who then pursued a degree at the University of Illinois, a Goy place. After graduation, he pursued his dream of becoming a screenwriter in Hollywood, and for a time, all went well. He wrote 3 scripts before joining the Army in 1942 to fight for his country. He returned to writing after the war, and in 1949 had become so good that he received an Academy Award nomination for his script of Champion, which propelled Kirk Douglas to stardom. Foreman then wrote the script for the award-winning Cyrano de Bergerac, starring Jose Ferrer, in 1950. When called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, now dominated by the Democrats who controlled the Congress, Foreman confessed to having been a member of the Communist Party before the war, but claimed that he had become disillusioned with it and quit when the war started. When asked to name other members of the Communist Party, he refused. He was then labeled an uncooperative witness and promptly blacklisted as High Noon was starting to shoot. High Noon is a movie about Will Kane, played by Gary Cooper, ironically, and his bride, played by Grace Kelly. They stand up to villains who are about to arrive on the noon train. These same villains had terrorized the town earlier. Carl Foreman had written the screenplay for the film and used it to advance his anti-witch hunt agenda. Based on the short story, The Tin Star, the movie was produced by Stanley Kramer. Working with Foreman, Kramer had already produced Champion with Kirk Douglas and then produced Home of the Brave. When shooting on the movie began, Foreman was told, because of what had happened before the House Un-American Activities Committee, that he would no longer be allowed on the set. He was not to be seen at the studio. The tension in the film is palpable all through. The sheriff, Will Kane, is deserted by the citizens of Hadleyville, and Hadleyville is the pseudonym for Hollywood, so watch for that. And this occurs right after his marriage. Even the deputy sheriff, played by Lloyd Bridges, cowers in a corner rather than face the bad guys. Bridges was nominated for an Academy Award for his convincing coward. In one famous scene, a character played by Cady Jurado, a former lover of the sheriff's, leaves town on a train that takes others with her. And as she looks out the window, she sees Will Kane, Gary Cooper, and turns her face away. After the climax, the main villains take possession of Kane's new wife, forcing him to confront his worst enemy. You also need to watch for the barn burning scene. Barn burning is a metaphor, but in this movie it's real. And Foreman is making a point, and I'll let you see what that is. High Noon won Academy Awards for Gary Cooper as Best Actor, his second. The movie also won for film editing. Foreman won for Best Screenplay. The movie won for Best Score, and it won for Best Song, Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, sung by Frankie Laine. Not everyone liked the film. John Wayne said the film was, quote, the most un-American thing he'd ever seen, unquote. Nevertheless, beginning to see the light, President Dwight Eisenhower, soon after he became president, screened the film at the White House, and very soon after broke with McCarthy and began to criticize him. In the meantime, Carl Foreman was forced to flee to Europe to avoid contempt charges and to find work. Like Ring Lardner Jr., who joined him, Foreman sent scripts back to the United States under an assumed name. In 1956, he co-wrote the screenplay for Bridge on the River Kwai. Now listen what happened. The Academy Award for the script was given to Pierre Boulez, who wrote the novel upon which the script was built. Boulez did not speak and was not able to write English. Yet he was given the Academy Award. It was not until 1984, after Foreman's death, that he was finally given the Academy Award for the script for the Oscar-winning film. In 1961, from England, Foreman produced and wrote The Guns of Navarone, which finally made him into a rich man. His war epic, The Victor, was filmed completely in England, where he met his wife-to-be. The film was released in 1963. In 1966, he produced Born Free, another major hit. And in 1970, he was named the Commander of the Order of the British in his adopted home country. I am particularly happy to introduce this Carl Foreman scripted film because his widow, Eve, has provided scholarship money to California State University Long Beach over the years. And because this film demonstrates that unless we stand up to the villains, we will all lose our rights.